I guess you're circulating the report to the legislature from the Red Hill Task Force. I think that's what you got there. But to start at the beginning, as of today, it's been about a year and 2 weeks since the Navy reported a spill from tank number 5 in the Red Hill facility and eventually calculated 27,000 gallons of jet fuel having left the tank, entered the environment, and penetrated into the groundwater below the tanks. As you are well aware, there's 20 of these huge tanks buried in the mountainside between Halava Prison and Kaiser Hospital, in that area. They were constructed in World War II, top secret. They became declassified in the 80s, and the Navy, pursuant to the law at that time, reported historic leaks to the Department of Health. So we have been, the Department of Health and the Navy have been engaged in doing an assessment of the contamination there for a decade. What's new about the situation now and the heightened interest in it was due to the report of this recent spill. But in fact, we've been working for more than 10 years, gathering data, putting in monitoring wells, reviewing the Navy's procedures, and trying to characterize the historic plume there. We know that over the past 70 years there have been numerous leaks. Now, every one of these tanks, I believe, has leaked to some extent. There's staining in the bedrock underneath each of these 20 tanks. Prior to this spill, there's known petroleum hydrocarbons measured under the tanks, and trace amounts of naphthalene and other contaminants actually in the Navy's drinking water supply. This is just the latest of ongoing chapter. It's been a decade. It's going to be decades more to continue this work. So in response to this recent leak, spill from Tank 5, the Navy has drained the tank immediately, appropriately. They got into a contract issue with the tank had just been refurbished and put back into service, and it leaked. So they had warranty issues they had to work through, and it took a long time. And they went in and they drained the tank and inspected it and all that. Long story short is they have identified more than 600 locations in this tank that had just been fixed and warrantied for 20 more years of service. But 600 areas which merited further investigation. They looked into about 50 of them and found, roughly 20 leaks. Right? So that's like 1/3 of the places they've looked at actually had leaks. So it's an indication that there's real problems with this tank. They've recently drilled through the tank to see if there was any product beyond the tank walls contained by the concrete shielding, and they didn't find any free product at this point. So we're assuming that everything that leaked out of that tank is gone into the environment. None of it is hanging around easily to be recaptured. The Navy also has recently installed 2 new monitoring wells on the Halava side, right along Halava Stream. We have some preliminary data from them that in fact they have found petroleum hydrocarbons in those wells. So those are a couple hundred yards off of the main line, the center line of the tanks. That does show for the first time potentially. Of course, you have to monitor a bunch of times, take a lot of samples, and get statistical data. But is an indication that the groundwater plume of contamination may be heading north towards Halava from those 2 wells. So there's a lot of work yet to be done to characterize the site, to identify where the plume is. We know it's directly under the tanks. We don't know how wide it's spread and in what direction it's going. This brings us to the task force report. The legislature asked the DOH to convene as task force. The Navy was represented, EPA was represented, Water Commission had staff joining us, neighborhood board members, community members, legislators served on this. And what this I think this report has been passed through the governor's office to the legislature, so it's a matter of public record. It's a collection of recommendations from all the task force members. There's not a unanimous point of view. Board of Water Supply has some very particular recommendations that the Navy wouldn't agree to. So it's basically chop suey, mixed salad. We threw everything in there. You get to see what everybody had to say. But it does give you a pretty good assessment of what we know as of December. The legislature has the opportunity now to extend the work of the task force if they wish, or potentially pass laws in response to the task force report. Looking to the future, the agencies, the Department of Health and the Environmental Protection Agency, have legal authority and oversight and regulatory authority over these underground storage tanks. It's somewhat limited. It is less than the authority that we have over your neighborhood gas station, and the difference is that these are field constructed tanks. They're not a prefabricated thing that's put into the ground, which has double walls, leak detection, and all kinds of monitoring and things required. But the Navy is responsible under the law to try to recover any of the spilled product, to identify what's in the environment, do remediation to the extent it's possible. And what we are working with the Navy on to this day, as of yesterday, all day telephone conversations, we're working on a compliance agreement. So that if this works, and we've been at it for months, and it hasn't worked yet, but we're getting close, the Navy would sign on to an enforceable agreement, a consent agreement that recognizes the authority of the enforcement agencies and sets up a dispute resolution process and all those legalities. And it would contain a statement of work that outlines over the period of decades what the Navy is committed to do and how they're committed to do it. And it would include increasing the ongoing maintenance of the tanks, providing greater oversight, more data, the drilling of more wells, how and when, and the whole scope of work up to and including upgrading the actual tanks. When that, let's assume it happens, we're hoping that document will come together and be ready for public notification in the March timeframe. There's no way of predicting if that in fact will happen. We're getting close in the back and forth of refining the language. I can, although it's obviously frustrating, I think it's been a positive working relationship. I think the Navy has brought a lot of resources to the table. It's a very complex organization. They have multiple elements in their organization that all have different interests and points of view, and everybody's trying to put it together into a single document. So it has been, I'll say exasperating, but that's just my term. But at the same time, we can look back and say that there has been real progress and that we are getting close. So looking to the future, this commission will have access to that agreement. It includes public participation and communication at any point. If one of the parties thinks it's time for a public hearing or an update or things, that can happen to try and make the work going into the future transparent and accessible and understandable to the public and to stakeholders such as the Commission who have a real interest in protecting the quality and quantity of groundwater. The couple issues just before I summarize, because we are looking at work that's going to take place for years in the future, and that really means that regulatory agencies have to consider the resources that we have to continue this work into the future. And as you've heard me say before, and I'm biologically programmed to say on a daily basis, our program is broke. We are struggling with the barrel tax issue. Some of the key people who are working on Red Hill are funded by the barrel tax, and we couldn't meet payroll in November. We are before the legislature and before BNF right now to get a loan from the General Treasury and to get an emergency appropriation and to increase the Department of Health's share of barrel tax revenues so that we can actually continue to fund the staff to do this work. So thinking, I raise that because we are all in government and we all have a job to protect the environment into the future. This job is not possible if not for public resources put to the task. And that's a critical issue for the Department of Health right now that needs to be resolved as we look forward. So I'm going to summarize it basically. You know, the theme that I've tried to express to simplify this complex issue regarding Red Hill is fix up the tanks or shut them down. If the environment is to be protected definitively, if we are to eliminate all risk to the groundwater from the Red Hill facility, then we would need to eliminate the Red Hill facility. As soon as when you have underground storage tanks, they are inherently a risk to the groundwater, which is why we have a whole regulatory program to limit that risk. The Navy in the future, with all the defense appropriations and reconfiguration of Department of Defense in Hawaii, may decide to reduce the facility or eliminate, replace it. We don't know. That's a decision beyond this, but that's the only way to end the threat. Everything else is mitigating the threat. And so the best way to mitigate the threat of these tanks to our groundwater is to apply the best industry standard protections, which is double line tanks with leak detection. Right now, if there's a leak in any of these tanks, it goes straight into the environment, and you don't know until after that damage has been done. With a double line tank, the interior tank would leak, it would be contained and detected immediately and can be removed before it reaches the environment. How to upgrade these tanks, or whether it's feasible or cost effective to upgrade any number of these tanks in the future, is going to be the big nut that the public is going to have to decide. If it costs $1, well, why not? If it costs $1 million, well, maybe. If it costs $1 billion, is it worth that investment? And that's a political public call that I think we all have a stake in, and that the Water Commission ought to be playing a role in and offering an opinion as to how much public resource ought to be dedicated to the protection of our groundwater. So get ready for that for the next 20 years, because I don't think this issue is going to go away. I think that's all I really need to say. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Denise first.
Sure.
Commissioner Buck.
Thank you, Gary, and best wishes for your transition. The consent agreement, is that a consent order that would be filed in federal court? Where is that? Where does that live, and who are the parties?
That's a good legal question. Thank you, Professor. So it's an administrative order on consent. That's what the EPA calls it. The parties are anticipated to be the EPA, the Department of Health, and the Navy. It's not clear to me who from the Navy signs this or would sign it, but the Navy purportedly knows that. So when we get the document together, it'll be run up and signed by whoever in the Pentagon needs to sign that. So it's an enforcement agreement between the federal enforcement agent and the federal entity, which is the Department of Defense. I don't know if that gets filed in the Supreme Court or what, frankly. I have to ask our attorneys on that. But the EPA process is, before it can be finalized, it needs to go to public hearing. Okay, so we're going to have, as I understand it, we're going to have a document that we all agree to, that we've all agreed to sign. We may have actually put our ink on the paper, but it's not going to be effective until it goes through a public hearing process. So people will have a time to chime in on it and criticize it, say it's good, bad, or indifferent before it takes effect.
So I guess my only comment on that is that, so it's as much time for the public to comment as is reasonable. I mean,
There's a 30-day notice, I believe, is.
yeah, I wonder if that can be, it's something to keep in mind, if that can be extended to at least 60, just given the technical issues involved. Sometimes agencies can extend that, so I would make a slight pitch for a slightly longer period of time. I think it's hard for people to gear up in 30 days. And then my other comment was, looking at the members of the task force, was the congressional delegation plugged into this issue? I mean, formally, I meant informally.
No, I mean, the legislature didn't ask the congressional delegation to sit on the task force. I've briefed every congressional office personally in DC. So they're up on it, and I know that the Navy responded, to a hearing in Congress, and so certainly the delegation is involved. Just on Monday, when this issue is before the Honolulu Board of Water Supply, there were representatives of the congressional delegation staff there, so it's being monitored very actively by our congressional delegation.
Uh,
Hey Gary, thank you very much again for all your service. You know, on page 15, the legislative recommendations from the DOH, is that something that's in the governor's package, or is that something that we need to work on for legislators to? And a new Commissioner Presser probably maybe has some comments. I don't know. I'm just curious. Those are well thought out, and I'm just wondering if those are things that we can help, or are we trying to just support those, or are they something that needs to be need some champions for?
Okay. Well, I always like to recruit more champions. Is there one of these recommendations
Well,
you want
I
to
mean, specifically the three from the Department of Health.
Okay, so they're looking at 46 other field constructed tanks.
Yeah, I
is
think
that
the barrel tax
Right.
and some resolutions, and I'm assuming the third one are rules that
Yeah.
the DOH would handle
Okay.
internally.
So, as part of this process, the task force process, the question came up and we investigated, okay, well, we got 20 tanks, underground storage tanks, field constructed tanks at Red Hill. What else might be out there? Well, there's another 20 of them out there. But most of those have been shut down or not in use. But they still could be put back into use, and I think we have a map of where they are in the report. So that's something that the Department of Health is going to deal with on an ongoing basis, I would hope. The second issue regarding the barrel tax, we've gotten, I don't know, do I need to defer to the director on this in terms of the attention that the governor's office has given to this issue?
Yeah, I think we can say, I mean, last I know, we have commitment both for the loan that needs to be forthcoming, emergency appropriation, and then the increase in the portion of the barrel tax that goes to the Department of Health from 5 cents to 15 cents. That's the commitment that I'm hearing, and that will be going forth to the road.
Again, the only one of those things that is purely within the authority of the governor is to give us a loan through BNF. So the legislature would need to approve any emergency appropriation or any change in the allocation of total barrel tax money that goes to our department. So I think we have received some initial support from the new administration in that, some assurances that they understand the problem and will be helping to deal with it, but you're not out of the woods until you get through the legislature. And the last one here is regarding UST rules. So the authority that we have in the Department of Health comes both delegated from the federal authority, the EPA, and our own state laws. The state law allows the Department of Health to issue rules regarding underground storage tanks, And rulemaking process, as you all are aware, requires drafting them, going through the Small Business Advisory Committee, going to public hearing, finalizing the rules, and the governor's ultimate signature of those. So that is something that we don't have. We don't have a draft to share, but something that could be pursued, for example, would be a rule that says all field constructed underground storage tanks need to be upgraded to secondary containment and leak detection standard by a certain date. So if that were the rule, that would set up an entirely different kind of situation that we have with the existing Red Hill tanks. So it's something some time off into the future, not during my tenure, but something that the legislature and future administrations should consider.
I attended the last task force meeting, and I was frankly very upset when I came away from that meeting, even though I felt Gary and our other state people on the task force really gave it everything they could. At that meeting, the language coming into it was a statement of, I believe it's a statement of policy that was agreed by all the different parties, and that statement was that within 10 years they would move toward secondary containment and monitoring. And I thought that was a good thing because it probably will take that long no matter what. These things are so enormous. Each tank is 12.5 million gallons. You know, this is one of the engineering marvels of the world. And, you know, they were built in 1942. And every single one of them has leaked, which means that the wall thickness of the steel has gone down in places to nothing. So it is, recognize Commissioner Beamer, you know, these things pose an existential threat to Honolulu's water. They're right in the center of the most productive well field on the island of Oahu. There are huge wells in both directions for the city and county, plus for the Navy and for the Army hospital. And if one of them really has a, you know, they've leaked several million gallons in the past, but whether the day that one of them has a large enough leak to dump a full 12.5 million gallons into the environment right in the middle of that aquifer is probably the day when Honolulu will lose ability to provide clean drinking water to the citizens, and the time when the confidence in Board of Water Supply's ability to provide drinkable water will fade away. Anyway, there was, going into that meeting, there was that agreement on that policy, and at the meeting, the Navy said they had changed their mind about it, and they would no longer sign off on that. And I'm not privy to the other discussions that are taking place in other venues, but I would suspect strongly that they're talking about, over some unspecified period of time, some best mutually agreed upon technology will be used. Something really, really vague like that. I mean, am I very far off track, Gary?
So I can't address the details of the existing text in the statement of work, but I think it's fair to share the basic concept that we have, and you're hitting on a point which is the most difficult conundrum that we have. If this is just in a mental model, if we were to say double line those tanks immediately, we as regulators, including EPA, do not have a proven technology to do that on tanks configured this way, because they've never been done before. Now, on one hand, you could say, like, well, what's so hard? Just slap up another line of steel, right? And we can build a ship. We can double line tanker ships, you know, with double hulls. We can put, you know, men on Mars. How hard is it really to double line these big tanks? But the reality is, as I mentioned, there's always a balance, a risk-benefit analysis, right? So how badly does the Department of Defense want to retain and sustain this installation, this facility, versus how much money it's going to take to upgrade, versus, you know, the risk analysis. So there's a lot, anything from better patching to putting in a bladder or a liner to different technologies, fiberglass or steel double lining. All of those things at this point today, as regulators, we can't say that's the way to go. Right? There has to be a lot of, it's going to be a few years of analysis and investigation to come up with a range of scenarios which are applicable. Right? And then the decision is going to be, as you said, what is the best available and practicable technology? The regulators are going to have to look and say, well, it looks to us, for example, that double lining is practical. You could do it in this way. The Navy may not agree. There may be conflict over that, or in order to get the funds to do that, you have to go through Congress, and you know, so there's a big unknown, and in terms of the process of how to get where we want to go and how far and how fast we can get there. So that all of that is part of why the negotiations of this statement of work and the consent agreement have been evolving, as we're struggling with finding the way to predict the future and to project future decision making based on data and facts and analysis that we don't currently have. I think in a perfect world, the Navy would love to have rock solid, you know, billion-dollar facility to operate. In the practical world, is that going to be possible politically through the military construction budget and through Congress and things like that? So we'll have to, that's part of why I'm saying, you know, the task before this commission as well as before the Department of Health and EPA is a task that's going to continue to require your attention for the next decades.
I'd feel a little more comfortable if we had some metric for the likelihood of one of these blowing out over a given time. And, you know, if it's 1% over 100 years, that's one thing, but if it's, you know, 20% in any given year, then I think it's very serious, and I'm worried that it might be more toward the latter. And I mean, I'd also like to understand from our hydrogeologists, what is the likely impact if 12.5 million gallons of fuel is suddenly dumped between the Halava shaft and I forget what the well's on the other side. Mauna Loa well. You know, what's the value of losing Honolulu's drinking water? I honestly wish the Water Commission were tighter in the loop, where a step aside, water quality issues are under Department of Health, but we do have a director here, and certainly the department has been working tirelessly and excellently in trying to deal with this. But I don't know. I'd like to ask our staff if they have any suggestions on actions that we can take.
Well, we do have a representative on our hydrologic staff who attends the meetings with Gary. Patrick does that, and he could provide perhaps some metrics. I don't know. The health department, because it's the principal investigator in this case, is the lead in this. We are monitoring it. We could ask a series of questions that we would at least like to get answers to. And maybe some of them are modeling questions. Some of them may be life expectancy questions. For example, what would be the normal life expectancy of the steel and the cement in some engineering sense? Perhaps we could investigate that independently and have get some outside judgment about that. And there may have to be measurements taken. I think clearly the work that's being done in terms of modeling, there's some debate between what the Board of Water Supply wants in monitoring and what the Navy so far has provided. I know there's been some requests for data. I'm not sure what the data status is. The Navy's tended to give, and Gary can comment on that perhaps. They tended to give summaries, but maybe not the raw data, and that's something perhaps would be helpful to have. So I think there are a series of protocols they've been working with that we could step up. But I think Gary's probably the best person to suggest how we might help the most.
Well, let me take a stab at that, Jonathan, since you outlined, I think, something I didn't originally address, which is what is the risk, and particularly what is the risk of a catastrophic release. I believe that the evidence shows, since prior to this recent spill, we know there's been groundwater contamination. And because our investigations show staining under each one of these tanks, and we have historic documentation from the Navy that there have been reports of leaks in each one of these tanks. These tanks have all leaked, and these tanks all may continue to leak at a low level, right? Below when you got a couple million gallons in a tank, how do you measure, a quarter of an inch up or down on the level of the tank? Well, is that temperature or is there a leak? So there's a level of detection where these tanks all could be leaking and it's not recorded, as it's a slow drip, a constant slow drip, if you will. I think that's happening, as I think that's basically what happens with underground storage tanks. None of them are perfectly, watertight, and if they are, they don't stay that way for very long. The Navy has been maintaining these tanks. To give them credit, they don't just let them rot, right? They take them out of service, they upgrade them, they do an assessment, they have a contractor that comes in and certifies them good for another 20 years, right?
But look what happened the last time they did that.
Okay, I'm just saying that's what I'm saying. You want to reduce the risk, you got to eliminate the tank, right? There's always going to be risk, no matter how well you manage it, and that gets to the point of what about a catastrophic risk, okay? Well, the 8.0, earthquake, right with the epicenter right at Pearl Harbor. Well, these things are going to shake, rattle, and roll. Are they going to actually survive that? Well, there's two things to bear in mind. If a tank ruptures, it will seep through the bedrock into the groundwater. We know it has been happening. It would continue to happen. The other thing that could happen is if it ruptures a pipe or breaks into the tunnel structure, the lower tunnel basically is a direct pathway to the drinking water well at the Red Hill Shaft that the Navy uses to support its population at Pearl Harbor. That would be a direct injection. You only have to go through the bedrock. You just flood the tunnel, flood the well, and run right into the groundwater directly. So those are issues that have concerned the Board of Water Supply. The Navy has addressed those in part. They have more work to do to armor the tunnel and to protect their well from that kind of catastrophic release. But all of those things are inherent risks so long as this facility is in operation.
I would like to consider having a study done of the life expectancy in terms of catastrophic failure of these tanks, with some kind of dynamic probability of a catastrophic failure. And also I'd like to have a hydrologic study on what would be the likely effect of a catastrophic failure in place. Is this something that commission staff
We can come back to it.
can work on, and they can also work with DOH. I don't really care who does it, but
We
I-
can,
yeah.
we can come back to you next meeting with a recommendation and some analysis, and you can then decide how you want to proceed. So why don't we put together a plan, talking with DOH about what we might do along those lines, and then you can debate it and decide how you want to proceed.
okay. Members,
I would just add, I mean, there's legislation, there's bills in on Red Hill, right, multiple bills, I think.
There, I assume there will be, you know, and that's, not all the bills have been submitted yet, but I would expect there's going to be at least a measure to extend the work of the task force. I don't know how much further any member of the legislature may feel moved to put anything else in, but you know, you're a long way off of getting a bill passed in any case. The legislature's just started.
I'm just thinking that I think it's a great idea to get a recommendation from staff, and it'll sync with wherever the ledge is at the time, because obviously whatever analysis is to be done is gonna take significant funding and staff, and cognizant of we're broke. I'm not sure the commission's any richer, so I think we'll know a little bit more in a month or two.
yeah,
Is that?
would you like to make a motion?
I don't. I usually like to make motions, but I just think on the next agenda, we take it up and get an update recommendation from staff if that's possible.
We can certainly do that. We can also make some inquiries with materials engineering firms to get some idea what the cost would be to get some different kinds of studies done, so you have a sense of what it would take. Whether it be this commission or somebody else that funds it, at least we have some numbers to work with.
Yeah, I'm good with that, as long as we're moving to whatever extent we can toward a possible someday solution. I think that's better than not.